The Planet of the Apes was one of the biggest science fiction films of the 1960s. With Godzilla spawning in the decade before and Star Wars in the decade after, Planet of the Apes was the big franchise film of its time. Lots of sequels, adaptations to comics and television, merchandising, and like those other two, indelibly leaving a mark on popular culture. 5 films at this time, plus a live-action series and an animated series, a not well-received remake, and a very well-received rebooted trilogy. It's the kind of success Hollywood executives dream about. And yet, much like those other works, it was an uphill climb to even see this film made. Let's take a look at some of the events that led to the creation of the iconic film that got this ball rolling. Our story begins in the Pacific during World War II. Pierre Boulle, a French engineer working in a rubber plantation in British Malay, quickly joined the French military in Indochina when the war began. After Germany conquered France, though, he joined the resistance movement in Singapore and began working as a British spy, working in what was codenamed Force 136. He was even given specialized training in blowing up bridges to help stymie Axis activities. But alas, when the operation to hook him up with the French resistance in Indochina ran into problems, Boulle finally gave up on waiting indefinitely to aid in the war effort and proceeded on his own, braving hazardous conditions in the hopes of helping restore the independence of his people. But not all of his countrymen felt the same. So when Thai villagers turned him over to the French authorities, he was now in the hands of the enemy, collaborators with the Axis. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, hard labor. After 2 oppressive years of imprisonment, Boulle finally escaped, eventually reaching Calcutta to rejoin Force 136 in fighting to win the war. After the war ended, he returned to the plantation for 2 years, but life just wasn't the same after that. Finally, one night as he was unable to sleep, he realized this wasn't what he wanted out of life. The previous 8 years had so changed him. He knew he couldn't go on any more like this. He needed more. He decided to become a writer. Never mind that he didn't have any formal education in that area. He was determined. So much so that he quit the very next morning, flew to France, sold everything so that he would have enough money to survive on for the next 2 years, and set about making a career as a writer. He had a little bit of an idea of what he was doing. In prison, he'd started writing a novel, but the pages were constantly being confiscated. In France, Boulle reconstructed the novel and worked to finish it, and finally in 1950, his first novel, William Conrad, was published. His second came out the following year, and the year after that, a landmark novel, Le Pont de la Rivière Kwai, The Bridge on the River Kwai. It was based in part upon an actual bridge being constructed and, of course, his own experience in the destruction of bridges. It became a massive hit, won a French literary prize, and was translated and beloved around the world. So thrilling was the story that it was made into a Hollywood film, sweeping the Oscars with 7 awards, including one for the author himself for Best Original Screenplay based upon a work in another medium. In reality, he hadn't actually written the screenplay. He was listed as a screenplay writer because Carl Foreman and Michael Wilson, the actual 2 writers, were on the Hollywood blacklist. So that's why he got credit for writing a script in a language that he couldn't even speak. With this success, Boulle began veering away from his own experiences and looking at the fantastical. Time Out of Mind and Other Stories came out soon after that, but the science fiction work that he'd be most famous for came about thanks to a trip to the zoo. Watching the apes, he was amazed by how human-like they seemed in so many of their aspects. Inspired by what he'd seen, he began working on a book with 2 possible titles: La planète mystérieuse, The Mysterious Planet, or La planète des singes, The Planet of the Apes. The latter was chosen, although the first English translation was the less polished Monkey Planet. By going with the Planet of the Apes, he had made clear up front that this wasn't about the shock of the revelation, but rather about the experiences of being in the situation. It wasn't supposed to be a mystery. It was meant to be a kind of social satire. Well, one interpretation was that it was a lamentation of the crumbling French Empire, with Algerians and Africans as the apes turning the tables on the French humans. It was more commonly seen to be a mockery of French society itself, that they were doing nothing but aping what they saw others do. Well, this now brings us to Arthur P. Jacobs. He was a publicist for a number of big names in Hollywood, like Jimmy Stewart, Warren Beatty, Grace Kelly, and most notably for our purposes, Marilyn Monroe. Oh, and also Gregory Peck, which will be important very late in our story. But what was notable about Marilyn Monroe was that she wanted to do a new picture and thought maybe Jacobs could be the one to make it happen. When Gene Kelly, another client, gave him the script for the picture What a Way to Go, Monroe was really excited about it, and with the star power he was able to assemble, it allowed Jacobs to become a producer. Despite Monroe's tragic death before she had the chance to appear, the film was a success and allowed him to get APJAC Productions off the ground. While in Paris working on What a Way to Go, Jacobs met a literary agent. Now, he was hoping to find something in the vein of King Kong, he said, but the agent suggested something else. Well, that didn't pan out. Jacobs didn't like it at all. But at a later meeting, the agent had another suggestion based upon the King Kong comment, the Planet of the Apes novel. He was intrigued, and after all, it was by the guy who brought us Bridge on the River Kwai. So Jacobs began shopping it around Hollywood with galleys to suggest at the possibilities of it, and not just to studios, but also to big stars. He was actually hoping he could get Marlon Brando on board, in hopes of lending the production some legitimacy. People were raising eyebrows at a film about talking apes, after all. To help sell his vision for the production, he paid $195 to Mentor Hubner to illustrate them. Hubner had a long career as a production illustrator on such varied works as Blade Runner, On Golden Pond, Westworld, North by Northwest, The Amityville Horror, The Karate Kid, Harlem Nights, The Neverending Story, and the Bakshi version of The Lord of the Rings, just to give you a small sample. When he asked if there was a job for him on Planet of the Apes, Jacobs assured him that there would be. Nevertheless, there remained hesitations at the studios. United Artists felt that the film was incredible. Brando himself said that he just didn't understand what they were trying to do. And despite the fact that this was the latest book by the maker of Bridge on the River Kwai, it was getting no publicity when the novel was translated into English and brought to America. When the new year rolled in for 1964, the bad news just kept piling up. Fox wasn't interested. Paramount had considered for a time but dropped it. And Thompson, the director of What a Way to Go, who had been working with Jacobs on adapting the book, went on to other projects. They had strong interest from Paul Newman, but unfortunately that was a double-edged sword. Paul Newman meant a higher budget to pay his salary, meaning more to lose if the offbeat film tanked. Things finally turned around when Blake Edwards, director of works like Breakfast at Tiffany's and The Pink Panther, read the book and took an interest. With him on board, Warner Brothers were willing to try it, convinced that Edwards would know just how to balance the terror of the situation with satire to create a science fiction classic. To adapt the screenplay, they managed to finally acquire the perfect choice, the mastermind behind The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling himself. The book has a twist to it. It's actually a tale within a tale, the account of the humans who wind up on the Planet of the Apes, only for the hero and his wife and child to return to Paris. But they find apes there ready to shoot them. And the people bookending the story are actually revealed to be apes themselves, who regard the story that they had just read, that the idea that human beings could actually be intelligent was so absurd as to practically be irresponsible to even suggest. Serling was looking for what to do next, the Twilight Zone having just been canceled. And when Edwards told him not to worry about money when writing the script, to let his imagination run wild, Serling was interested enough to join. He even took the story's ending into a darker direction, ending with the image of the tiny human family on Earth now surrounded by approaching apes as the scene goes black, knowing their fate is sealed. However, there were immediate conflicts about how the story should unfold. Jacobs felt Serling's dialogue was just too smarty pants, that it didn't build up suspense for the ape reveal, and that the hunt wasn't large enough. Serling's issue was that he feared the film easily degenerated into farce. They were talking about apes dressed like human beings. It was going to look silly. He thought of perhaps trying to diffuse it by having one of the astronauts laugh along with the audience at first, right up until the ape he was laughing at shot him in the gut. He also felt that the book just wasn't good science fiction. Rather, it was a very effective allegory instead. The theme of it was quite solid, he felt, but the story itself was unimpressive. The germ of the idea was inspired, but it was a packaging that Serling struggled to believe in. But he did have an idea that Jacobs loved to death, inspired by one of his Twilight Zone episodes, the one, "I shot an arrow into the air," about astronauts that, it turned out, had been on Earth the entire time. The planet of the apes isn't hundreds of light years away, Serling said. The planet is actually Earth. Serling's fingerprints were all over this script. Fear of atomic war, critique of racism, smart dialogue. The ending was changed to something more hopeful, even if it was realized by the surviving astronaut that this was actually the Earth. Serling actually enjoyed the bleakness of the book's ending, but agreed this would be the better choice. However, the most memorable part of the film wasn't down to any of the players that we have discussed. Now, many have claimed credit for it, but it's a virtual certainty that we have Don Peters to thank for it. Peters had worked with Edwards on Experiment in Terror and was doing concept art for Planet of the Apes, and so was thinking very visually about the film. Serling's idea that this planet was Earth all along had been revealed by finding an old film by the Atomic Testing Commission. But Peters thought this didn't really give people the punch to the gut that it needed to be. It had to be something that suddenly tossed in your face the impossible, to make you then finally realize the implications. So he painted part of the ape's archaeological dig with the crown and arm of the Statue of Liberty having been excavated. Many tried to take credit for this, but Edwards agreed that it was the result of discussions with Peters, and that Peters definitely is the one that deserves credit for the haunting final image of the film. Peters' role was essentially to provide proof of concept for the film as a horror adventure, to prove that this could be believable rather than silly. After a great deal of work, it was deemed a success. However, much of the details of it would never be realized. The technology level of the apes was originally going to be that of the modern day, with helicopters participating in the hunt, for example. By the time of the final film, the technology level would be pulled back, with the apes forgoing any mechanical transportation, only horses. Likewise, the tank belonging to the astronauts would be removed, and they would travel only on foot. Now, this change has often been attributed to reasons of budget, and admittedly it did help there, but that was merely a pleasant side effect. The decision was actually reached at that point because they realized there was a greater potential for the story implications if they limited the apes' technological level, as well as helping maintain the secret of the film. It's one thing for apes to use rifles. It's another for them to drive recognizable cars on recognizable streets in recognizable cities. Thanks to the artwork, ideas were injected into the film to up the excitement, the action, and the adventure of the early and late portions of the film. And by December of '64, Serling submitted a second draft. The shot by the ape is not a fatal one to the stomach, but rather the lead character, Thomas, being shot in the throat, to render him mute for a time like the rest of the humans. Serling's draft also had convinced Jacobs and Edwards about the viability of the humans from Earth returning to Earth. There had been a fear that it wouldn't make sense, and Jacobs was starting to push Serling to make the humans that crash on the planet of the Apes, which actually is Earth, to still be humans, but humans from another planet. They now agreed it would work fine for both of the planets to be Earth. There was also a fourth astronaut added who died in the crash, named Blake, after the director, a little joke from Serling. Serling was getting a bit frustrated and included an alternate ending as well, where Thomas finds the confirmation he needs by seeing the Statue of Liberty, but with no torch, instead extending its middle finger. The reason for the joke about Blake was that it was becoming more and more evident that Edwards was becoming disillusioned with the film, and Serling himself ended his connection with the production after the revised second draft. Warner Brothers took a look at the revised script and estimated the cost at over $10 million, way too high for this kind of film. Planet of the Apes became a sinking ship that everyone quickly abandoned, the studio, writer, director, and artist, leaving Jacobs to try to figure out how to salvage the production. Desperate, he went back to Boole, hoping that he could adapt his own work. It's uncertain whether or not he knew that the author hadn't actually done that with Bridge on the River Kwai. Unfortunately, Boole didn't like the changes to the story, especially the Statue of Liberty and the implications of nuclear war. Humanity shouldn't bring about its own tragic end, he felt. Rather, it should meet a tragic end because that is the fate of all civilizations and species. He described the statue as being, quote, a temptation of the devil, that it would appeal to filmmakers but be despised by the audience. Respecting the author's views, Jacobs kept him in the loop on developments, but he went looking elsewhere for help to get the adaptation made. Jacobs managed to successfully convince Franklin J. Schaffner to take over directing for the film. Schaffner actually had experience with Rod Serling. While working on the anthology show Studio One, which Schaffner regularly directed, the pre-Twilight Zone Serling showed up looking, in the words of those present, like a clean-shaven bum for the production of his story, Buffalo Bill is Dead. Schaffner remembered being very annoyed with Serling because his shoes squeaked on the studio floor while he was trying to make his picture. However, the two would work together again later on for Playhouse 90, where Serling's story Forbidden Area was being made. And also appearing in that story was one of the actors that Schaffner was regularly calling on, Charlton Heston. Schaffner and Heston worked on another Playhouse 90 story called Dark December, which was scored by Jerry Goldsmith. Jacobs decided to go back to his original plan. If I get a big-name star, the studios will be more interested in the film. The reason Jacobs had approached Schaffner was because it was the best way to get Heston to come on board, and that was the perfect time to try to woo him over. Now, on the one hand, Heston was a huge name. He'd had mega hits in The Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, and El Cid, really establishing his bona fides as a star. On the other hand, though, his recent picks were duds, and he had won the 1963 Harvard Lampoon Award of Worst Actor. So it was a solid name for the production, but not so huge as to make the budget skyrocket, and in need of a part that was going to restore his reputation. Plus, Heston had always liked science fiction as a child, but he found SF films to be disappointing. There was no real meat to any of the parts in them. It was either just stomping around in makeup or having to flee from things. Thomas felt like a real part, a character that he could do something with, and that attracted Heston to the role, breaking his personal rule of avoiding being attached to a work that wasn't already financed. But even that wasn't good enough. Jacobs couldn't find anyone willing to take a financial risk on a picture called The Planet of the Apes. Richard Zanuck of Fox said that no one was going to believe Charlton Heston talking to an ape. It sounded too much like a low-budget potboiler project that they didn't want anything to do with. While he worked on that, Schaffner and Heston were getting frustrated with work on their own film, The Warlord, which had all kinds of annoying interference from Universal. In fact, there was suspicion surrounding a young man who worked in Universal's editing department who kept wanting to show up and watch their work on the film. And naturally, there was concerns that this was some nefarious plot on Universal's part, and as a result, he was ejected several times. But finally, his persistence paid off and they let him stay and watch the making of the film. He insisted there was no ulterior motive. He just wanted to watch and learn. It seems that he had an interest in films. His name, if you're curious, was Steven Spielberg. What helped Jacobs finally get a toe, if not an entire foot, in the door was Dr. Dolittle, a big musical piece he was doing with 20th Century Fox, riding the coattails of The Sound of Music. So every time he showed up to discuss Dolittle with Zanuck, he would bring up Planet of the Apes. It got to the point where Zanuck would shout, "No!" before Jacobs could even get to the film's name. Finally, Zanuck said that if they shot some test footage to show if it could be believable, he would at least consider it. The financing for that would come from the budget for Choice Cuts, another of Jacobs' films that Fox was doing. Edward Robinson, who starred with Heston in The Ten Commandments and would later appear together in Soylent Green, was cast as Dr. Zaius, but was adamant that he would not shave his beard off for the role. The screen test would need to incorporate that into his makeup. This worked against them. Dr. Zaius looked less like an ape than like some kind of mutant, and the result of the trial was a draw. Nobody laughed, but the makeup wasn't as good as what they needed. The director and star were now starting to have second thoughts themselves, and even Mort Abrahams, Jacobs' number 2 man at APJAC, was wondering if they could pull it off. Charles Eastman, a script doctor, was brought in to revise Serling's script to add natural humor and flesh out the characters more. In particular, Dr. Zaius was to be redefined so that he wasn't simply the villain, but rather his behavior was born from his secret knowledge and deepest fears, that he was not just some anti-human bigot, but saw himself as a vanguard against a threat to their existence. They also removed the 20th century elements, at least wherever they could, so that the fact that this was Earth wouldn't be too obvious. While working on Dr. Dolittle in the UK, Jacobs happened to run into Roddy McDowall at the airport. The two had met previously, and during this time, Jacobs talked at length about the role of Cornelius, and how McDowall would be ideally suited to play the character. So enthused by the idea of getting McDowall to play in the film, Jacobs actually let him in on the twist ending, after swearing him to secrecy, of course, hoping that the part would interest him. And McDowall was intrigued, especially the idea of heavy makeup like that. He found the idea of that fascinating as an actor. By now it was 1966 and Fox was releasing a science fiction film called Fantastic Voyage. Abrahams contacted Zanuck at Fox on his boss's behalf and was met with a demand. "This is the last time you will ever bring up Planet of the Apes to me. If you ever, after this meeting, do it again, we will never meet again without a specific agenda that you will stick to." Abrahams agreed, and Zanuck said, "Okay, you have 5 minutes to sell me on this film." The takeaway from the meeting was, let's see how Fantastic Voyage does. If it does well, we'll assume that we can do something similar with Planet of the Apes. It did well enough, bringing in $12 million against a budget of $5 million. So, if they could turn in a budget for under $5 million, Planet of the Apes had a chance. Privately, they didn't think they could, but put together some numbers, including cutting Robinson from the film, figuring they could get a British actor for a third of the price. The reason they were thinking British was because they were strongly considering shooting it as an E.D. Levy, a film made to support British filmmaking by being subsidized by a tax on ticket sales in return for making a lot of British first concessions, like 85% of the film being shot in the Commonwealth. Coincidentally, This was the reason that Stanley Kubrick was in the UK making his 2001: A Space Odyssey, and also having to tackle the ape problem with their own makeup. Attempts were made to learn how they were pulling it off over there, but the word came down from Kubrick's company, we wish you the best, but no, we're not going to tell you what we're doing. If you're curious what they were doing, we'll be looking at it in 2022 with a look at 2001: A Space Odyssey. To make a bad situation worse, Jacobs had had a heart attack and was recovering during this hectic time. And to add to his stress, Eastman's early pages from a fresh rewrite of the script came in, and it was thoroughly ridiculous. For instance, one of the astronauts, named Index Zero O'Toole, says to his fellow astronaut, "Don't forget, I haven't seen a woman in 50 years. Jacobs removed Eastman and finally turned to Michael Wilson, the same Michael Wilson that had written the adaptation of Bridge on the River Kwai. It was explained, Heston liked Serling's script, but he wanted more from it, especially for his character. The revision that he turned in was what they wanted, except for the last 10 pages. He refused to turn those in. The reason was he hated the idea that Thomas would die at the end of the film. He wanted to change that. And not the Statue of Liberty part. He felt that that worked. Indeed, he felt that is the true culmination of the film. The point, he argued, was that Thomas's death was the culmination of the story that Rod Serling had written. It worked. But that was because Serling had done as a straight science fiction work. But Wilson had revised it to give it a more satirical edge, a more Gulliver's Travels feel like the original, but not to go into the realm of farce. The Statue of Liberty reveal fits that without the death because it is both tragic but also the final dark joke played upon our hero. Killing him after that would be anticlimactic. But despite his fervent views, he grudgingly gave them what they wanted. Thomas and Nova in the torch of the partially unearthed Lady Liberty, where he laments what his brothers have made of the world, before being shot and dying in a fight with the apes, the only hope being that Nova running off with possibly the last evolved human growing in her womb. John Kelly was brought in next for uncredited rewrites of Wilson's script. This despite the fact that, in the end, he'd rewrite about 2/3 of the scripts, but he never asked for credit. Several names were changed, including Thomas becoming Taylor. Some of the dialogue was polished and improving the relationship between Cornelius and Taylor, from an antagonistic one to a case of mutual bemusement. But most surprising of all was Schaffner finally coming around to Wilson's argument about the ending. Instead of Taylor's death, the finale is the discovery of where they truly are. He also restored some of Serling's dialogue for the build-up to that, the discussion of man, to make clear the significance of what Taylor was about to see. But despite all of the work of getting the script just right, this all hinged on one absolutely vital element. You had to make sure that the audience was going to accept the premise. The most brilliant script could not save this film if the audience lost their suspension of disbelief because the apes looked silly or obviously fake. Masks they knew were out of the question. Static, expressionless faces would pull the audience right out of the experience. An expert in England was brought in, and after explaining how his techniques could make the apes very expressive, it sounded like the solution to their problems. Until it was realized this guy makes animals. Animals that can't talk. Having the actor speak English was something his work never had to deal with. If they tried it, it would look silly. Desperate, Ben Nye, Fox's head of makeup, tried in vain to come up with a solution, and was pressured to get Bud Westmore on the strength of his work in the film The List of Adrian Messenger. However, the conversation was overheard by a new lab tech named Tommy Berman, who said that actually the part that everybody was really impressed with in that movie was done almost exclusively by John Chambers. Chambers learned how to do some dentistry when he joined the Army, but after working on making partial bridges for patients' mouths, he moved into even more involved medical and appliance work. He was involved in facial reconstruction, prosthetics, casting body organs for medical purposes. After he was discharged from the Army, he went to Hollywood to adapt what he'd learned about helping the maimed and the disfigured to try to create realistic makeup effects for film and television. His reputation as the go-to man of the industry led to him being called the Ghost Laboratory Man, as his work was the unsung element that made his films believable. Actors would come to the specialized lab that he'd made in his garage for solutions to their problems. Most notably, Leonard Nimoy, who required prosthetic ears for some science fiction show. Upon learning that Chambers was the man responsible for the work that had impressed the Fox executives, Nye contacted Chambers in Spain. He was at work on the show I Spy, the episode coincidentally called The Warlord. Confused and busy, he finally read the script by the time he returned to LA after the new year. He emerged from his car, clearly gobsmacked, as he met with Tommy Berman and said to him he was going to win an Academy Award, and Berman would be with him. He knew this was going to be very, very difficult to pull off, but he already knew how he could do it, in broad strokes at least. Working with Dan Stripeek, the pair worked first on Jacobs and Abraham's approach of looking more Neanderthal-like than full-on ape. But Chambers was dissatisfied with the early tests. He was convinced he had to go more ape, because in addition to work on preparing for Planet of the Apes, they were now part of the Fox makeup department and had to do work on other productions. A frustrated Chambers nicknamed Jacobs Frick and Abrahams Frack, and referred to any attempt to please the two of them as a frickin' frack solution. He essentially was giving them whatever they asked for, but he always knew that what they asked for wasn't what they actually wanted. So he busied himself and his small crew, including Berman, trying to pull off a look that was ape-like without becoming bestial to finally give them what they needed instead of what they kept asking for. Actual chimpanzees were brought in to be examined up close by the makeup department. Trips to the zoo became more frequent, with many shots of the animals taken from all angles. When Chambers perfected the technique he was going for with the apes, he showed it to the producers, who were floored by what they saw. Chambers immediately pounced. "If this face shocks you after 3 years working on this movie, just imagine what it will do to the audience." The next step was then to make the approved makeup capable of expression. The point that Chambers always went back to was the cowardly lion from The Wizard of Oz. Chambers pointed out to everyone that if you watch that film, the makeup that is used never gets in the way of the actor's ability to perform. It never inhibited the comedy, or the fear that the character had to show, or anything else. They needed to do the same thing with their apes. While the process was much, much more elaborate for the apes, they had also had the benefit of time, new materials to work with that hadn't been available in the 30s, new techniques in order to use them, especially many of the cutting-edge ideas that Chambers himself had developed and was training the rest of the makeup department to use. They had to create an entire ape society, after all. It was expensive to create this kind of convincing makeup for so many actors, hundreds of thousands of dollars to pull it off. But Jacobs used that as a selling point, promoting the film by saying they, in fact, had million-dollar effects in the film to realize the apes. Jacobs often sounded like P.T. Barnum when he was selling films to studios or to the public. Still, the intent was less to boast and more to reassure, to make clear this wasn't what everybody kept fearing, a cheap-looking film of actors in Halloween masks. The trailer would showcase the effectiveness of their technique by showing first the ape and then the actor being portrayed, showing the world of difference between the two, but without looking fake. The fact they looked so different was a reason some suggested that the money spent on actors like Roddy McDowall, Kim Hunter, Maurice Evans, and James Whitmore was a mistake. But Fox was 100% behind them on this. Besides the recognizable names on the posters, You were getting talented performers, people who had honed their craft. The makeup still allowed them to clearly speak, gesture, move, and even offer many expressions. The makeup gave humans the appearance of apes, but good performances would transform them into believable apes. While everyone loved how the makeup turned out, there was one serious problem that had the suits very worried, and that was the fact that it took so long to put on and take off, and that there were going to be a large number of extras in this film that needed to have makeup. So finally they had a meeting with Chambers, and basically that meeting went something like this. Look, we get when it comes to the principal actors, we want to have maximum articulation. We want them to be able to fully emote through the makeup, and you've done an excellent job with that. We don't want to change a thing there. But the thing is, we've got all of these extras we're going to have. We're going to have dozens of extras in some of these scenes, and we can't have the same elaborate process for every single person out there. It'd take all day. It'd exhaust our entire makeup department, and it would cost us more money than we could possibly spend. Can't you cut some corners in here somewhere? Well, first off, we can cut it with pullover masks for the apes that are very far away. Like riding on horseback in the background, we could totally get away with that. But anything else, you're going to need full appliances for it. Otherwise, it's going to be obvious that they are different from the principal actors in every scene they're in. Now, I have thought about this problem, and there is a solution to it. Okay, well, let me explain. The nose, see, the nose is the big problem we've got to worry about. The noses all have different sizes and shapes. Some stick out a lot, some are very wide. The nose is always a problem when you're dealing with this. You have to then customize it like we do for Roddy McDowall and Kim Hunter, because you have to accommodate the face underneath. But if you're trying to create something much more universal like this, the shapes of the noses get in the way. It winds up distorting the face of the mask there, and it looks all wrong. You've just done all that work, and it's totally ruined. They don't look like an ape anymore. But if we didn't have to worry about that, if we went with actors who had very flat noses, for example, and certain other facial structures, then I could put these appliances on much faster. I'd make them universal. We'd just slap them on, send them out, get them back, take it off. We'd save you a lot of time and money. Well, that sounds great. Why aren't we doing that already? Well, it seemed like a bit of a ticklish situation. Why? Because I need nothing but Chinese actors to play all the orangutans. Oh, and only Filipinos to play all the chimps. So after some uncomfortable shifting in chairs, they said, but this would work. Yeah. Because of the facial structures would speed up the makeup process. Absolutely. Do what you gotta do. Let's hope no one finds out, and if they do, let's hope they don't read anything into that. That is perhaps exaggeration, but if so, it is only slight. Believe it or not, they were quite nervous about the potential implications of what they were doing. This is 1967. Racial tension in the United States was boiling over. The Watts riots had been only 2 years before, remember, and right there in Los Angeles. The last thing they wanted to do was have their film associated with overt, old-fashioned racism. In fact, so nervous were they about the potential implications with African Americans that the NAACP came around accusing them of discrimination because they weren't hiring black stuntmen, until they finally admitted, look, just understand, we're terrified of dressing a black man up as a monkey, okay? In the end, several black stuntmen were hired to play gorillas, but most of the gorillas were played by white stuntmen in the end. But nevertheless, Chambers knew what he was doing. The makeup was very effective. In fact, some might argue it was too effective. Kim Hunter, who played the chimpanzee Dr. Zira, started crying after she looked in the mirror. The face was so alien to her own that she lost her own identity. She felt like she didn't know who she was anymore, terrified of this feeling of having her sense of self annihilated. She wasn't sure that she'd be able to perform like this. She had no idea if you could ever get used to that feeling. And the makeup was so trying to put on her, she had to take a Valium just to get through it every time. As for Roddy McDowall, while claustrophobic and panicked during the casting of his face, when it came time to the makeup, he would just fall asleep in the chair. It's reported that the first time the makeup was completed, he woke up, saw himself in the mirror, and began running around acting like a monkey for the better part of an hour. When he pulled himself together and got back to the matter of acting for the film, he looked at how best to not just walk like a human being, but rather to walk like how an ape man would. He tried emulating actual apes at first, but none of them worked out. Surprisingly, the walk that worked best was an imitation of Groucho Marx. He had just the right look to it. 20th Century Fox was elated with the results, so much so that for a while, visitors would be allowed in to see the actors in full makeup. The result was always astonishment. Astonishment and rude behavior, poking at their faces and false ears and treating them like props rather than people. Hunter compared it to actually being in a zoo, to be gawked at by these guests and treated as something unworthy of basic human decency. They finally made clear no more visitors, lest the already troubled actors be driven crazy with frustration. McDowall, however, started to enjoy the experience, so much so he became a bit of a prankster, allegedly walking into some executive meeting at the studio, sitting at the table and watching the stunned people stop and stare at him, and then finally getting up and leaving the room having never uttered a word. On one other occasion, he knocked on the dressing room door of his good friend Julie Andrews, who had the fright of her life when a chimp man was seen on the other side. The downside of it, though, was that removing that makeup at the end of the day was not only uncomfortable and tedious, the actors weren't even being paid for their time. They appealed to Heston because he was also the president of the Screen Actors Guild, but despite everything, Heston had to grudgingly admit in this situation the rules did not allow for special compensation. The rules would later be changed to address this kind of thing. Plans to make the film in the UK were scrapped. Planet of the Apes was going to be shot largely on location and close to home. Unfortunately, that provoked nervousness with Fox, and Zanuck ordered the shooting schedule to be slashed from 55 days to 45 to save money. Also a problem with the location was that, while the American Southwest had a lot to offer for the scenery of the film, they were shooting the picture at the start of summer. The heat was brutal. Day one, Jeff Burton, playing the astronaut Dodge, passed out from the high temperatures. In the 4 films that followed, shooting would be done in the winter to make it bearable. They shot at the Utah-Arizona border with the astronauts trying to find signs of life. Kelly, who had given the script a final polish, was on hand for any rewrites that would be needed as shooting went on. Things moved slowly. The astronauts filmed for days trekking over the scenic Southwest, but it was taking much longer than what the bean counters had wanted. Abrahams, who was serving as line producer, tried to get Schaffner to pick up the pace, but Schaffner insisted that without establishing the atmosphere at the start of the film, it wasn't going to work. He was doing what the film needed, not what an arbitrarily adjusted schedule said was needed. Abrahams finally went back to Zanuck and argued they had to have the 10 days back. And finally Zanuck gave in. But he gave a very stern warning not to go over budget. Dr. Dolittle was proving a nightmare of a shoot, and he didn't want to see the same problem on Planet of the Apes. Eventually the 2 ill-fated astronauts left, replaced by McDowall and Hunter, who were in even worse shape as the dark suits absorbed the light and heated them up. The makeup was designed to allow the actors' sweat to escape rather than to pool underneath it on the skin surface, but that did little to help with the oppressive heat. To make matters worse, the straws had been left behind, and obviously in that situation, staying hydrated was vital, but there was no way to normally eat or drink in that kind of a mask. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Charlton Heston personally hiked a mile in order to get the straws and then a mile back through the brutal heat in order to help them out, getting dubbed Charlie Hero by McDowall for that. But whether or not the suffering for art was needed, it did indeed produce fine art. Jerry Goldsmith, brought on to score the film, found the desert crossing inspiring. When the first cut of the film was made and Schaffner warned Heston that the first cut always made you want to curl up and die, the desert crossing proved itself even at that rough stage. The film promised apes with its title, but it teased towards their delivery, which then arrived in force. The oppressive heat was at last left behind as shooting moved indoors for several scenes within the ape settlement, such as the pens, the lab, the chapel, and the room where the trial was held. The first was a particularly trying time for Heston, as he was recovering from a cold, and the blast of the hose was especially awful. But the raspy, hoarse voice he had as a result of it all actually fit the situation of his character rather well. Now that they were here, many more people were requiring ape makeup, but with the process fine-tuned and with the new appliances, it was going on much faster, and McDowell and Hunter were giving advice to the performers who were having to not just act, but do basic things with it for the first time. It was during the trial that Heston performed his first ever nude scene. Normally disapproving of them for their cheapness, he fought for this one because he felt it made the point most apparent of how dehumanized Taylor was here, to be stripped and left naked like an animal. The film would be released 9 months before the MPAA's rating system, and so all films at the time were either approved for general audience or not approved for general audience, with nothing in between. Because they successfully lobbied for the artistic necessity of the scene, and because no other rating existed at the time, Planet of the Apes is one of only 2 films rated G that feature nudity. The other is The Bible in the Beginning. During the trial scene, Rod Serling came by. Despite the strain of the early production, he remained on good terms with everyone involved. In fact, the presence of his fingerprints on the storyline and the twist ending would lead many to presume a much larger role for Serling in the production than actually was warranted. Some even going so far as to suggest that this was originally supposed to be a Twilight Zone movie. But while he might make the odd exaggeration, he said 30 or 40 drafts were made, it was more likely that he was counting minor revisions, since he only turned in a second revised draft before leaving. But he was nevertheless happy with working on some of the later projects. Some have asserted that in private he was disappointed with the film, but he did praise it in public, saying, quote, "I also gather the humor was one of the key reasons for the success of the picture. I blew it and Wilson did it. They offered me collaborative credit almost immediately, but it's really Mike Wilson's screenplay, much more than mine." After the studio work was finished, shooting moved back outside to Fox Ranch. That's now owned by the state and has been renamed Malibu Creek State Park. It was used for many different purposes by the studio. Most famously was probably for the television series MASH. Months of preparation there had created the ape settlement, the grasslands, and even the cornfields for the hunt. The watering hole was actually made for the film Dr. Dolittle and was still there, so they used that, with a waterfall that had been helped along by some fire hoses. But it was still summer, in Southern California, and so it was intolerably hot. Even Heston had to call it quits for a while, despite being dressed in nothing but a loincloth. This was because the dirt that he had been fighting on had become so hot they could no longer touch it. The hunt was when the mechanisms of the studio were truly brought to bear. 65 makeup artists were on hand to deal with the apes and making the humans look like the primitives that they were to be seen on screen. Jacobs, of course, exaggerated this for the press, as he had been throughout the production, claiming that Hollywood was paralyzed because all the talented makeup artists were seeing to his film. He had previously leaked other tales of a camera being destroyed and Heston nearly being killed by a falling boulder, the boulder that is seen in the film, and that on the closed and secure set over 200 actors were on hand to shoot the scenes. All fictions to boost publicity for the film. But noticeably, it did work in the end, as the buzz ahead of Planet of the Apes was quite high. Though in some ways life was unsettling in that regard. A photo from the set shows Evans in his Dr. Zaius makeup, relaxing while waiting for when he would be needed. In the photograph, he was reading the paper. And the ape who will decry man as a savage destroyer intent on poisoning the world is reading a paper whose headline announces, China has just tested its first hydrogen bomb. The final scene, appropriately shot at Point Dume, D-U-M-E, was a point of contention. While much thought had gone into how to really make it work and into all the technical aspects, the bone of contention was what Taylor's reaction would be to it, the final line of the film. Boole himself had offered a suggestion of, "Oh my God," which had been expanded slightly with, "We finally did it. We did it to ourselves." Heston, however, had pushed for the speaking of finally being home and his cry of lamentation, which ends with, "Damn you, God damn you all to hell." The third option was to do Heston's version but without the profanity. But Heston insisted, when told, "No, don't swear," that he wasn't swearing. He was quite literally cursing, calling upon God to damn the ones who ended civilization, and as such it should be allowed. As he sarcastically noted to them, "Do you really think the appropriate response to discovering humanity literally bombed itself back to the Stone Age and then went farther back should be met with a desperate cry of, 'Shucks! Darn you!'" In the end, Heston's choice won out, being one of the most well-known moments in cinematic history, of a broken man beating the sands in lamentation of the self-destructive stupidity of his race. The statue on location was a half-sized recreation used for the shots from behind. For the final reveal, they wanted more. The statue had to seem like it was embedded within the sand and rock, that the landscape had formed around it, rather than it just being plunked onto the beach. A matte painting was clearly called for here, and Emil Koza was given the job, creating an 18 by 36 painting on masonite, a preferred material when you're going to be doing some degree of camera work with the matte painting. In this case, it was to expand the frame from Taylor and Nova to reveal the statue that way. In a work from an earlier time, this would no doubt have been a cut to the full frame, the sight of the statue met with loud orchestral music to deliver the shock of the moment to the audience. But they wanted to do something different. The animated expansion of the frame over a 2-second period is a reveal of the statue, letting you take it in on its own terms, and the only sound, the sounds of the sea. Indeed, the idea of traditional loud orchestral music was completely anathema to the film. Jerry Goldsmith, you'll recall having worked with Schaffner and Heston on Playhouse 90, had worked with Schaffner on another film, and the two got along very well. A few years before, he had been at Universal Television, sharing the hall with other musical legends like Quincy Jones, Lalo Schifrin, Robert Grusin, and the guy in the office next to Goldsmith, John Williams. They would have a friendly rivalry going between them, seeing if they could outdo the others. And during this time, Goldsmith created an atonal music for John Huston's Freud. He was completely in agreement with Schaffner on the statue reveal, as he said, "It's important to know when not to play music." For Planet of the Apes, he would again revisit the idea of atonal music, and used very unusual techniques to create the otherworldly soundtrack. He used a collection of 40 stainless steel bowls to create sounds, and turned the mouthpieces of the French horns around, told clarinet players to make clicking sounds with their keys instead of playing them normally. And a refugee from Disney was brought in with a trunk full of bizarre musical instruments. The unique soundtrack perfectly fit the atmosphere of the film, and Goldsmith received an Academy Award nomination for it. Speaking of awards, a lot of buzz was being built up around Dr. Dolittle by Jacobs, because they'd had a bit of a problem, see. Despite all the hard work and the huge budget, the film was a box office bomb and savaged by critics. The only way to salvage the picture was for Jacobs to get people to give it a lot of awards, and so he lobbied hard for that to happen. and it helped to a small degree, most notably with an award for the song Talk to the Animals. Well, the following year, when it was Planet of the Apes' turn, he wanted to see the film similarly acknowledged, especially for its makeup. Jacobs and Zanuck spoke with Gregory Peck. Remember that he was at one time represented by Jacobs? About the Academy Award for a special honorary award that they would occasionally offer for some kind of notable achievement in filmmaking. It had been done a few years earlier for The Faces of Dr. Lao. Well, word came down that they were going to do it. It was going to be a recognition of this masterpiece of makeup for Planet of the Apes. Nye and Stripke of Fox's makeup department were called into Zanuck's office to discuss the tricky situation that they couldn't both receive the award. Honorary Oscars could only go to an individual. But Stripke immediately spoke up, saying neither of them deserved it. John Chambers deserved all the credit. He was the pioneer who made it happen. His award was given to him by Walter Matthau, although delivered to the presenter by a small chimp in a suit. At Chambers' request, they did not send the chimp out on roller skates, as they had originally planned. But aside of that, the film was otherwise the opposite of Dolittle for the studio. While a science fiction film, never mind one on a planet ruled by apes, was unlikely to receive much recognition from the serious people who celebrate filmmaking, it was the critics and audiences who were won over by the picture, bringing in close to $21 million at the box office and rave reviews. It would help to keep 20th Century Fox afloat, spawn 4 sequels over the next several years, and that would be enough of a jewel in the studio's crown in order to justify to them to invest in George Lucas's science fiction project the following decade. So, let's take a look then at the film itself, Planet of the Apes.